it reminds me of what used to happen in the Middle Ages, bloodletting. And when they let out the blood, the patient didn't recover, usually, unless a miracle happened. And so what did they do? They let out more blood, and the patient got sicker and sicker. I'm afraid that central banks will do the same thing now. They'll raise interest rates, but because demand is not the source of the problem, inflation will not be tempered. And what will they do then? Raise interest rates more until they kill the patient.
Starting with windfall profit, why, can you explain to us in a few words, why do you think that it's important for Europe, mainly in Europe, to impose this windfall tax on profits?
Well, Europe and the whole world is going through, obviously, a turmoil caused by spikes in the price of energy, oil, gas, also food, many other commodities. Those spikes have resulted in massive profits for a relatively few firms. At the same time, they have caused massive problems for ordinary individuals just trying to get by, trying to make their energy bills, buy food to survive. Terrible as it is in Europe, in many developing and emerging countries, it's even worse. The interesting thing is that most of the companies that are making these massive profits didn't do anything to deserve it. Sometimes we have this discussion, are profits exploitation, or are profits the just desserts of having invested more, putting out more effort? This is a particular case where there's no debate. It is very clear that the oil companies didn't do anything to deserve the high oil prices. It was Putin's invasion of Ukraine that was at the source of the problem. So they're getting clearly windfall profits. So there's an obvious answer. You tax the windfall profits and use some of those revenues to help those who are suffering. In many ways, the issue is even clearer in the United States than it is in Europe, because the United States, we're close to energy neutral. So all that is going on in the United States is a redistribution. It's a redistribution from consumers to rich oil companies, to rich fossil fuel companies. Totally unjustified.
The European Commission yesterday proposed measures, so it's mainly on energy companies. Do you feel that we should go beyond energy companies and focus on all the companies that made profits?
I think it should go beyond that because, in fact, this has been a big disturbance. There are some food companies that are making massive profits. We are emerging from the pandemic, and the pandemic itself was a major disturbance. And there are certain bottlenecks that got developed, and prices went up. And again, windfall profits. In the United States, we did a study at the Roosevelt Institute where we looked at the magnitude of the increase in prices. Overall, it's very clear the increases in prices cannot be justified by an increase in cost. So it's very clear that there is something more going on than just passing on increased costs. But even more interestingly, that in those parts of the economy where there's more market power, as evidenced by a higher level of markup, the increase in markups were even larger. So there is evidence of what is going on is, at least in some places, an exploitation of market power.
With all the energy disruptions that are expected to happen because of the war and because of Putin's decisions maybe to disrupt it, you feel that we are going directly in the direction of a recession in Europe? Is it inevitable?
No, it's not inevitable. First, many of the problems that many of the households are facing are a result of the way prices of energy, electricity in particular, have been structured. Take France, which is performing better in many respects than other countries. France is largely dependent on electricity produced by uranium. Nuclear power has not been affected in the same way that the gas price has been. But even in those parts of Europe where there is less reliance on gas or a limited reliance on gas, electricity prices have gone up in proportion to the price of gas. And that's because the way the prices are formed is basically called marginal cost pricing. If they had used older ways of pricing, they would have stabilized the price and the consumers would not have suffered as much. So the first thing is there needs to be a rethink very quickly. It should have been done that last February and March of how prices are determined. The prices, the way they're determined, have an incentive effect. That's positive. But they have a huge redistributive effect that is far larger than the benefit that you get from the incentive effect. And so there has to be a very quick and massive rethinking of the pricing of energy. The second point is that inflation that is being faced today is not excess demand. In fact, your question reflected a lack of demand, a worry about a recession. And yet, central banks around the world are pretending or acting as if it was a demand created inflation. Typically that is the source of inflation, but not now. And using a wrong recipe, for the wrong diagnosis is giving the wrong prescription. And so I feel that in the United States, but the ECB is following along. Raising interest rates is not going to lead to more energy. It's not going to lead to more food. It's not going to relieve any of the bottlenecks. In fact, raising interest rates is going to make things worse. It's going to make things worse because the cost of making the investments that are necessary to relieve the bottlenecks is higher. And so the bottlenecks will not be relieved as fast as they would be if they didn't have these increases in interest rates. In the United States, we have a further factor that one of the major factors contributing to inflation is the increase in rents. But raising interest rates is crashing the construction market. That's way down already. And the evidence historically is that increasing interest rates gets passed on in higher rental rates. So I'm afraid they're contributing to inflation rather than dampening it, except if they do this so ruthlessly that they cause a real serious recession. But then the cure is worse than the disease. It reminds me of what used to happen in the Middle Ages. bloodletting. And when they let out the blood, the patient didn't recover, usually, unless a miracle happened. And so what did they do? They let out more blood, and the patient got sicker and sicker. I'm afraid that central banks will do the same thing now. They'll raise interest rates, but because demand is not the source of the problem, inflation will not be tempered. And what will they do then? Raise interest rates more until they kill the patient.
I wanted to know if you still think that the IMF is at the source sometimes, exaggerating some issues that developing countries can have. And do you see the same critic that you made 20 years ago to the IMF today?
So, the IMF has reformed enormously. The reforms began actually under Strauss-Kahn, and they've accelerated. And under the current leadership, things are going much better. It's a big ship, so steering it in a different direction is enormously difficult. But today, at least in rhetoric, they are more concerned about inequality, more concerned about poverty, very concerned about climate change. And in at least some of their negotiations, they actually reflect these principles. Much more worried right now about the World Bank, the institution where I was the chief economist. The major issue right now are issues like climate change and dealing with the healthcare crisis and the debt crisis that will emerge as with the energy, food, and interest rate increases. And unfortunately, the World Bank has not taken the kind of global leadership that the world needs right now.
What are the solutions that you are proposing for the global governance to move on after this deal, the OECD deal that was announced, but that is taking time to come into effect?
So ICRICT has been advocating reforms in the global tax system for many years now. And in some ways, we're very pleased at the progress. The move to be more inclusive in the discussion was obviously positive. The agreement in principle on a formulaic approach, setting up standards that would enable the implementation of that kind of formulaic approach, very, very important. And the agreement in principle on a minimum tax, stopping this terrible race to the bottom. Those are all positive. On the other hand, you start looking at the details of what has gone on, it's very disappointing. Take the minimum tax. We advocated that it should be 25%. They chose 15%. And then they added huge carve out. So it's not even 15%. We worry that this minimum will become the maximum. And our agenda was originally to provide more money to developing countries. And if that were to happen, it would be actually less money. Pillar 1 is even worse. The principles reflected in Pillar 1 are not consistent with any sound economic principles. They talk about a taxation of residual profits. All profits should be taxable, not this mythical notion of a residual profit. There's no underlying economic principle other than the big companies didn't want to be taxed. Secondly, it applies to a very small number of firms. Thirdly, it allocates those profits, that small residual profits at a very low, at a particular rate, all to the sales, which means the developing countries, which are producing the goods, don't get any revenue. And so if you look at where the additional revenue is going, it's not going to the developing countries and emerging markets, which was one of the original impetuses for our work. So neither in concept nor in scope is it, I think, the right, it's clearly a lot more that has to be done. In many ways, these outcomes are not a surprise, because while the inclusive framework was more inclusive than what went before, it really didn't reflect the way global governance ought to be done today. The UN is the international organization that brings country together, and I think the appropriate place for a discussion of a global tax treaty is at the UN, and with the specialized agencies of the UN that have the capacity to deal with these problems. So while I'm very pleased at the progress in the adoption of many of the overall overarching ideas that ICRICT has advanced, I am disappointed at the details that have emerged. And then finally, I have to say, it doesn't look like it's going to be adopted, sadly. As weak as it is, as pro-advanced countries as it is, as distorted as it is, the very countries that insisted that it be biased towards the advanced countries and their interests, some of those very countries seem like they refused to adopt the principles, the agreement. And so the prospects of getting this flawed agreement through do not look very good at this juncture.
And I saw the measures that you were proposing on this report by ICRICT, and you're absolutely right. It's very important to come back to this topic, even if, of course, windfall profits are on the news every day right now. So yeah, both of them are very important.
Yeah, windfall profits are in the news today. The problems of the inequities of our multinational system are going to be with us even after this current conjuncture passes. And so we both have to solve today's crisis, but we also have to make sure that we get a tax system that is just, fair, and efficient going forward.